everyone. Welcome to this evening's Network for Responsible Public Policy discussion entitled, What Are Human Rights Anyway? As we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we're going to explore this question. I am tonight's guest host and moderator. My name is Penny Venetis. I'm a law professor at Rutgers Law School. Through the Rutgers International Human Rights Clinic, which I direct, I have been working with a network for responsible public policy and their programs to connect people with thought leaders who educate and inspire. Tonight will not disappoint. We have two amazing guests, Professors Elisa Massimino and Susan Herman. I will give you a very, very brief description of their major accomplishments, and there are many of them which are relevant to today's discussion. I'll start with Professor Susan Herman, who is the Ruth Bader Ginsburg Professor of Law at Brooklyn Law School. Like Justice Ginsburg, Professor Herman served as General Counsel to the ACLU. In addition to serving as the ACLU's General Counsel, Professor Herman also served as the ACLU's President for almost 2 decades. Professor Herman is an expert in constitutional law with a special emphasis on criminal procedure. Because of this expertise, Professor Herman has discussed constitutional law related to the most important and controversial issues of our time on radio and television, including NPR, CNN, C-SPAN, NBC, MSNBC, and PBS. She has written several important books, most notably one of her books, Taking Liberties, The War on Terror and the Erosion of American Democracy, which was published by Oxford University Press, was awarded the 2012 Roy C. Palmer Civil Liberties Prize. She has received way too many awards to list in the brief time that we have together, so I'll direct you to our website for that. Our second speaker, Elisa Massimino, is no slouch either. Professor Massimino is the executive director of the Human Rights Institute at Georgetown University, where she also holds the Father Robert F. Drinan Chair in Human Rights. Currently, she is also a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. She has also served as a senior fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and also as a practitioner in residence at Georgetown's Walsh School of Foreign Service. For 10 years, Professor Massimino was president and CEO of Human Rights First, one of the nation's very first and still leading human rights advocacy organizations. Professor Massimino has also won too many awards to name. Suffice it to say that The Hill has consistently named Professor Massimino one of the most effective public advocates in the country. And Washingtonian magazine has repeatedly named her one of DC's most influential people in foreign policy. You can get our distinguished speakers' full bios on the NFRPP website, where you can also find an extensive library of videos from past programs, as well as a wealth of information on relevant topics. Before our speakers begin their presentations, I want to give you some background information that will frame our discussion this evening. Today, together, we are asking, what are human rights anyway? Are human rights different than other rights? Where do human rights come from? The United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was enacted in 1948, were like phoenixes rising from the ashes of World War II, where science and modern efficiencies were used to commit unthinkable atrocities, and where bombs that could wipe out the entire human race were dropped not once, but twice on a tiny island nation that had itself committed unthinkable atrocities during World War II. Nonetheless, rather than dropping bombs on each other, the world's countries, including former mortal enemies, committed to writing a very basic set of principles for the new world order. The Universal Declaration's drafters' hopes and dreams and plans were that if these basic principles were enacted, there would be no future devastating world wars. The basic principles embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights boil down to these very simple concepts. Number one, every person matters, with an emphasis on the gender neutral. 2, there are a set of basic human rights that govern everyone and all of us at once. 3, all people are the same and equal, period, no exceptions. 4, every person can marry and divorce who they want and have a family. 5, everyone can own land and express their views. 6, every person has a right to food, shelter, education, and leisure time. This is an oversimplification, but really these are the core principles that permeate the Universal Declaration. These basic principles form the recipe for every person everywhere to have a good life, a happy life, where they could be citizens in participatory governments and be free. Very, very lofty. World leaders told us that the Universal Declaration's principles were just the starting off points. They were a bare bones framework for a more just, equitable, and democratic world. They assured us that additional actions would be taken by nations working together, of course, to ensure that the hatred and horrors of World War II would never be repeated. They were true to their word in some respects. Today, there are 9 core human rights treaties, as well as dozens of other regional human rights treaties and protocols that expound on the principles first articulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 75 years ago. But, and this is a big but, there is still war. The world is filled with hate and discrimination. There is genocide. There is slavery. Books are being banned and burned. Millions of people have no access to food, shelter, or education, or leisure. And our planet is burning because we can't even agree that climate change even exists. As we think about this path-breaking document on its 75th anniversary, during our time together today, we are re-examining the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What is its significance today? Is it a naive pipe dream? Or is it alive and well? Has it transformed our still very imperfect world into a better place? I can think of no better people to explore these and other questions with than Professors Susan Herman and Elisa Massimino. So I'll give both of you the floor. Professor Massimino, why don't you start us off?
And so I also just want to thank so much the Network for Responsible Public Policy for convening us tonight. It's been a pleasure to learn more about the network's work as we've been preparing for this. So it's a privilege to be invited to speak with everybody tonight. I'm going to reiterate, I think, a little bit of what you said, Penny, about the origins of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But maybe put a little bit of a slightly different spin on it. As you said, it was after the devastation of World War II that nations came together to outline these fundamental rights. But really important in that action was to understand that they saw this as the necessary foundation for global peace and security, not just stating that these rights exist and are inherent, but acknowledging that the degree to which nations can ensure respect for these rights is related to global peace and security. So that consensus was codified, as you said, in 1948 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which set out in 30 plus articles the rights of every member of the human family, that they are entitled to just by virtue of their humanity. It recognized also the equality and interdependence of economic rights, like the right to housing and the right to food and education, and work with civil rights, like the rights to free assembly and political participation and freedom of conscience. But I think it's really important to remember, especially in the midst of so many struggles that we continue to have in our world, and also the critiques of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that it's not a utopian wish list. It's really a kind of a hard-headed conclusion that was born of this cataclysm and bitter experience, that the only way to the path to global peace and security is that all people are able to enjoy these fundamental rights and freedoms that are essential to a life of dignity. And that core principle at the center of the UDHR is a lesson that we humans seem to have to relearn over and over again. So what are these rights? You outlined them, Penny, but I also encourage everybody to take a look at the Universal Declaration. It's not long, it's quite succinct. But there are a few principles that kind of unite the Universal Declaration. One is that the rights are inherent. They don't have to be given by a government. They don't have to be earned or inherited. They belong to people simply because they are human. In other words, human rights are inherent to each individual. We're born with them. That's one of the approaches of the UDHR, is that governments don't grant these rights. They exist inherent in all humans. Governments can respect them or not respect them. Also that they're universal. As you said, they're the same for all human beings. It doesn't matter the race, the sex, religion, ethnicity, political opinion, national or social origin. We're all born free and equal in dignity and rights, because they apply to everyone in the world, and they're inalienable. They can't be taken away. Nobody has the right to deprive another person of their human rights. People still have rights, human rights, even when the laws of their countries don't respect them, or when the countries violate them. This is one of the core understandings of the Universal Declaration. For example, in a country where slavery is practiced, enslaved people still have rights, even though those rights are being violated. That they're indivisible. This is a little bit of a tricky concept, and it's a little bit wonky, but it's really important to understand that there are, and you'll hear more about this, I think, from Susan, but there are different kinds of rights in the Universal Declaration, and they seem, there are affirmative rights, and then there are, there are more negative rights, but the Universal Declaration makes clear that human rights allow everybody to live in dignity. So you need to have the freedom, the security, decent standards of living, for example. These are all bound up together. They're interdependent and interrelated. That means that respect for one of these rights, like the right to a decent living, the right to work, contribute to the realization of a person's human dignity through the satisfaction of their development, or physical, psychological, spiritual needs. And one right often depends on another right. For instance, the fulfillment of the right to health might depend on, fulfillment of the right to education or the right to information. So these things are all linked. You can't pick and choose which rights or which people are more important than others. So that's kind of the package that as a world that we signed up to with the Universal Declaration. But in reality, the ink was barely dry on that, what Eleanor Roosevelt called the Magna Carta for all mankind, before the Cold War geopolitics kind of split it in two, with the West, elevating civil and political rights while dismissing economic rights as somehow socialism, and the Soviet bloc elevating economic rights while crushing individual liberty and political freedoms. This is quite, tragic and ironic, especially since, FDR was with the four freedoms, really spelled out so succinctly and beautifully the interdependence of, the necessary components of a life of dignity, being respect for both freedom of conscience and freedom from want. And Eleanor Roosevelt's famous declaration that, where, after all, she asked, do universal rights begin? In small places close to home, so small and so close that they cannot be seen on any map of the world, she said, but they are the world for the individual person, the workplace, the school where they study, the home where they live, the community where they live. And if we can't uphold respect for human rights in those small places close to home, she said, we're going to look in vain to see them respected in the broader world. But unfortunately, with the Cold War, these were split apart, and there were attempts to recover that essential wisdom of the Universal Declaration in the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, for example, and Dr. Martin Luther King's declaration towards before he was murdered, that we're now moving from the era of civil rights to the era of human rights. But half a century later, we're still suffering from this hangover of the Cold War dynamic that has kind of left the human rights movement still hobbled and somewhat marginalized, I think, and fractured. Meanwhile, we have the dynamic that there are critics, many critics of human rights, who declare, periodically that the age of human rights is over, and they cite persistent rights abuses and democracies in decline. And those critiques come from, the political left that blames the human rights movement for its inability to address poverty and inequality, and from the right, which charges that the movement has strayed from the so-called core rights, which the previous administration in the US laid out as religious freedom and property rights, and accuses the movement of being too political. But I actually see something really interesting going on here in the United States, something changing about that. And also out in the rest of the world, I see activists, organizing and building public support for human rights in their own communities. Here in the United States, we see these people-powered initiatives like, the movement of the Dreamers or Black Lives Matter, or look at the Parkland students, and then the moral revival of Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign, which I think is really exciting. These are gaining momentum, and they're kind of breathing new life into the idea of the interconnectedness of human rights. Whether or not these movements would call themselves human rights movements or part of the human rights movement, they are at their very core advancing the ideas in the Universal Declaration. These kind of intersectional movements, they know that the name and shame tactics and appeals to moral suasion by themselves are not going to be effective. And they also understand, I think, that shying away from political engagement, whether that's out of some misguided desire for purity or an overly narrow view of what constitutes human rights, that will fail to deliver on the promise of the Universal Declaration. And I think that the effects of the global pandemic that we're still reckoning with, and also the growing realization that structural racism weakens our democracy, that has accelerated this dynamic in a way. And the growing movement around the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN is offering a really interesting new framework that's informed by these current realities, with the potential to kind of supercharge these interrelated movements, I think. And these new activists that really understand that the enforcement of rights, including economic, social, and cultural rights, is an inherently political fight. This could be, the new American human rights movement. It also, I think, and this is my last point, really underscores how important living up to these rights is in the global struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. Just getting back to this idea that I mentioned at the beginning, where the Universal Declaration came from, is, how do we ensure global peace and security? At the UN General Assembly meeting last month, you heard a lot of talk about how democracies deliver, and we're going to demonstrate, that democracies can deliver for people, meaning deliver the elements of a life of dignity for all people. That's the promise of democracy. But it's the fact that democracies haven't really delivered on those things that has provided the opening for authoritarians around the world to advance a very different vision than one that's put forward in the Universal Declaration. And I think that, again, underscores this central wisdom of the Universal Declaration, that respect for human rights is the predicate for global peace and security. Again, we're relearning that lesson now and scrambling to make it true.
Thank you. your comments were really thought-provoking and enlightening. I'm taking notes and writing questions as you speak. Professor Herman, we're going to turn the floor over to you to frame our discussion. And after you're done, I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll invite our audience to participate as well.
Thank you, Penny, and thank you, Elisa. I'm also taking notes and formulating questions. Elisa and Penny are both specialists in human rights law, and I am not. For a long time, I've been doing civil liberties, and the ACLU works in like 14 different areas of civil rights and civil liberties. So I've really had to be kind of a civil liberties generalist. So as some of you know, I just published a book called Advanced Introduction to U.S. Civil Liberties for the Elgar Press. And perhaps some of you were at the event that the network co-sponsored with my law school, Brooklyn Law School, and the ACLU last Friday, which was a panel to discuss kind of the future of civil liberties. The link to that is going to be available on the network website as soon as the video is available, which should be within just a few days. So one of the things that I've been thinking about is kind of the difference between civil liberties and human rights. And one of the things I talk about in the book, and to me, human rights is a much broader concept than what I was accustomed to. So not being an expert in human rights law, I wasn't really familiar with the contents of the Declaration until quite recently. And the quite recently where that began was 5 years ago on the last big anniversary, the 70th anniversary of the Declaration, where because of my position at the ACLU, I was invited to an all-day program sponsored by the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin, which included a number of panels with very high-level governmental officials and a major 45-minute address by Irish President Michael Higgins. I felt really honored to be invited to participate in this, and reading the Declaration carefully, I was really sort of blown away by all the wonderful things it contained, and I really had no idea. I would have thought that after World War II, if all the countries were trying to find a text they could agree on, maybe it would be like one vague sentence. But yeah, the Declaration is not that. It's far from minimalist. It's just chock full. So I was especially delighted to be part of the culminating event that day in Dublin, which was a reading of every word of the Declaration from the steps of the City Hall in Dublin, joined by the Lord Mayor of Dublin, the Irish representative to the UN, and a human rights activist from Afghanistan. So this was all pretty great. And it was also extremely interesting during the day to watch all these panelists and to see how much the Irish people, there were a bunch of people in the room other than the panelists, and they all knew a lot about the Declaration and they all were talking a lot about it. And comparing that to the fact that I hadn't known what was in it, and I dare say most Americans don't know what was in it, which is why when we had this idea to have this program, we were thinking, wouldn't it be great to kind of share with more people what's in this really quite amazing document. So I have to tell you, there was also a kind of undercurrent to that day for me, because the Irish people in the room were somewhat condescending and sometimes even contemptuous of the United States, and by extension of the ACLU and of me, because we were not serious about economic equality.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the panels that day were about how to have more economic equality, what to do about housing, and so if you think about having that kind of discussion at that high a level in the United States, there has been no administration that has been that serious about equality and providing economic opportunity, I think, since Franklin Roosevelt was in the White House, right? He learned a lot from the New Deal. So that really made me think very seriously about the difference between American values, what we actually do and what we think, as compared to what is in the Declaration. In the United States Constitution, of course, in the 18th century, and Elisa, you were using the words hangover, I feel like we still have a hangover from what was in the 18th century Constitution, even though we really should have recovered a lot during Reconstruction, but we didn't enough. But the original Constitution doesn't mention equality at all, for good reason. How do you without the hypocrisy of the Ever Award, mention equality as a goal in a document that's tolerating slavery? So when equality is first mentioned in the US Constitution in the 14th Amendment, it is equal protection of the laws, which the Supreme Court, rightly or wrongly, and I think there is an argument that it was wrong, has always interpreted as a negative right. The government has no obligation to help any of us get housing or to help any of us improve our lot or be happy. All they have the obligation to do is to not treat us differently from one another. So it's a question not about whether they have the obligation to do anything for us. The only obligation that they have is not to do anything to us. Now, whether that concept again is right or wrong, and I think it is arguable that the Reconstruction Amendments were intended to put the United States more on the footing of the European Republican tradition than the very Anglo tradition, the libertarian tradition of John Locke. But the 18th century Constitution itself is really quite libertarian, and the Bill of Rights, which we vaunt, is mostly, again, negative. Congress may not, Congress shall not establish any religion. Congress shall not tell us what religion we can be or what we can say. Governments shall not lock us up, deprive us of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. But there is virtually nothing in there about what governments should do. So this whole question of what are rights all about? So as Elisa mentioned, one of the big watersheds to me in American history was the Roosevelts. And during World War II, first during the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt was promoting very different ideas about what government can and should do, which were not familiar ideas to Americans traditionally. And during World War II, he talks about the four freedoms, the freedom from want, et cetera. And so to me, Eleanor Roosevelt's role here, of course, she's selected to be, take a leading role in developing the Declaration, as well as trying to sell it to all the countries in the world, including her own. And she was taking very seriously all these ideas of interdependence, that you can't, as Martin Luther King says, what does it matter that you can sit at the lunch counter if you don't have the nickel to buy a hamburger? So this is very much the Roosevelt's concept, and clearly they were true believers. But I think that the Cold War tension that Elisa was talking about after the Declaration actually was present even during the deliberations. So Eleanor had a tough sell. She had to convince the State Department not to object to the Declaration. And everyone, there were people who were concerned. They did not believe, many people did not believe that the government had an affirmative obligation. That was socialism, that was communism. That's not what we do. We're libertarian, we leave people alone and they all make a fortune on their own. So what she ended up doing, she got the State Department to agree not to object by assuring them that the Declaration, even though it contains all these affirmative rights, right to housing, a right to, as Penny was saying, a right to education, right to healthcare, that did not necessarily mean that the government was obliged to stand up and provide us all with housing. What Eleanor Roosevelt said, and she's very quotable, isn't she, Lisa? So the phrase that I loved, she said, okay, so we're all agreeing to this, but really this is just a bridge on which we can stand and talk. So even then, the United States did vote in favor of adopting the Declaration, but the Soviet Union did not, the USSR, and they abstained. They didn't actually vote against it. But their point, of course, was that they were very much believed, as Lisa was saying, in the socioeconomic rights and the obligation of government. And they were much more suspicious of the civil and political rights that we endorse, that are kind of the main thing that we see in the Declaration. So when we have celebrations of Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Human Rights Day, all our government talks about, if you look at the website, they only talk about the civil and political rights. They just never mention that there are affirmative rights in there. So I think, again, most Americans don't know what's in the Declaration. And if they did know, I don't know that they would agree. So I love Elisa's optimism. And in fact, there are patches around the country where you can see at a state level, not at a federal level, a state or local level, you see things happening like Montana having a right to a clean environment in its constitution that enabled all those young people to actually win a lawsuit to say the state actually has to do better. Maine pretty recently included a right to food. So there are pockets where, in fact, there are things that are happening that actually would implement some of the rights, the affirmative rights in the Declaration. But on the whole, I think also the United States has not actually signed on to some of the major covenants that were supposed to put meat onto the bare bones of the Declaration, right? Anything having to do with economic rights, we just don't sign on to. And we don't sign on to everything anyway, because of a kind of sense of American exceptionalism. So that sort of leaves you to question, well, so if there's this whole list of rights in there, and if the government has no obligation to do any of that, what does that all mean? Is this just hollow? Is this just on paper? And that's where what both of you have mentioned that is so important comes in, because that's where the right to dignity comes in. So if you look at the Universal Declaration, which I've just pulled on here, look at the preamble. The first thing the preamble says is, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And then it goes on to talk about the connection between dignity and the various rights that it goes on to articulate. Article 1, the very first article, says, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. And the final thing that I want to show you is here in Article 20. You have to get there. I am scrolling. Article 29, which says, everyone has duties to the community in which alone the free and full development of his personality is possible. Okay, so this whole idea of dignity, brotherhood, starts to sound a little bit like the value that the French call fraternity. So we all know that we talk about liberty and we value liberty and we kind of are trying to deal with equality, but we don't mention fraternity. And the French say it's a trinity, liberté, égalité, fraternité. And it's more than just a motto in France. Fraternity is actually in the French Constitution. I have, Penny was talking about the gendered issue. I have a little problem with the gendered nature of the word fraternity or brotherhood. But René Cassin, who was one of the principal authors of the Declaration, avoided that by, instead of talking about fraternity or just brotherhood, he uses the word dignity, which is a much more general word. But the basic idea of dignity is that we should all treat each other in the same way that we would treat our brothers, members of our family. And if you believe that, that goes a long way to actualizing the other rights. So I think one of the major moves of the Declaration is to make the questions of rights, of our aspirations, not only about government, it's about all of us. We all have a duty to one another, to treat one another as dignified human beings. And as you both were saying, you really have to have, you can't have liberty and equality if you don't have fraternity, if you don't have people taking that attitude. So it's not a matter of a choice of values or too many values. All of those values are really interdependent. Okay, so I'll give you an example of how this matters, fraternity. So around the same time, it was the December of 2018 that I was in Dublin and kind of learning about the Declaration for really the first time. And around that time, there was a lot in the news about two different humanitarians, one French and one English. And they had done more or less the same thing. They were each pretty disgusted by their government policy toward desperate refugees. And so they each went on seek and rescue missions. So Cédric was a French olive farmer, and he had his farm right near the mountains where desperate immigrants from Africa would come and land on the Italian side and then cross over the mountains trying to get into France because they didn't have documents. So he would go and find people by the side of the road who were freezing, and he would bring them to his olive farm and let them stay a while and help farm olives, and then kind of put them on their way and show them how they could avoid the authorities and just help them out. He was, for a long time, they let him alone because he was doing nice things. But after a while, he began to annoy some people. So they prosecuted him and they convicted him of violating French immigration law. So in a truly remarkable decision in July of 2018, the French Constitutional Council said basically he was doing the right thing. And he cannot actually be prosecuted for helping desperate people because he was actually upholding the French constitutional value of fraternity. Now, that to me is really remarkable. It was the first time anyone in France had suggested that fraternity was not just an ideal, that it was actually an actionable principle, where in the same way that we can go into court and say, my prosecution violated my freedom of speech. Or in South Africa, you could go into court and say the government has to do more to help me get housing. In France now, people can go into court and say, no, I was simply exercising my obligation of fraternity. I was treating other people as human beings. So the parallel story at the time in the United States was Scott Warren, who was a volunteer with the No More Deaths group in Arizona. And he was confronted with people who were not freezing to death. They were in the desert, which was unbelievably hot, and there was no water to drink. So he and his colleagues would leave water in the desert for people just to drink so they wouldn't die of dehydration. And they had a home where sometimes they would let people stay for a day or two if they were just in terrible physical condition before they went on their way. So Warren also and his colleagues were kind of let alone by the government, but at one point when the Trump administration came in and started with a zero tolerance policy and wanted to, kind of keep everybody on the other side of the border, Warren was prosecuted for 3 felonies. He had one trial in which the jury hung. He then had a second trial in which the jury actually acquitted him of the felonies that were remaining. But the main way that Scott Warren, and some of the things that there were other charges against him, misdemeanors, one of which was that he had abandoned property, essentially a littering charge, by leaving water jugs in a national wilderness area. So the judge in that case dismissed the charges against Warren and dismissed charges against some of his colleagues on the ground that they were acting according to their religious beliefs. So there's this statute, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and when they made a claim and say, oh, okay, we did this because it's our religious conviction. That was, that was something, and that was a reason to excuse what they had done. So I've been thinking for a number of years. You wrote a little something about pairing the cases of Herou and Warren, which I hadn't seen anybody else do, of how much of a difference it makes when you have this element of fraternity, where in France, what Herou said was, he said, I'm doing this because I'm a Frenchman, not because of my individual religion, because I'm French and this is what all French people are supposed to do. And everyone in his case keeps saying, well, you're right, that is what you're supposed to do. And he says, after the council says, this is what fraternity means, he says, at last, now we finally know what fraternity means, and this is it. So where does this come in the United States? So I've been thinking a lot about what we miss by not having a concept like that among our fundamental values. So first of all, we're missing the idea of affirmative rights. And second of all, we are missing the idea that there's a public value that's like dignity or fraternity, as opposed to, as in Scott Warren's case, everything is individualistic and libertarian. And if your particular religious beliefs or deep convictions are that you have to help other people, well, maybe you get an excuse, but that's not a public value. So most people, I guess, write a book before talking about it. But what I'm talking to you about is a book that I'm sort of thinking about. And I'm kind of on the track of writing a book proposal about this, because what I want to talk about is whether there actually is an American version of fraternity. And I feel like, having endorsed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we've already agreed to this principle, but nobody knows it. So I think that's where I'll stop.
Thank you. That was really terrific. And I was scribbling some questions, and I'm going to ask this of you before I forget it, because I have not had a chance to write it down. And I hope I'm not going to get too legal or too wonky. I will try to keep this question.
What's wrong with legal and wonky? I have to ask you.
Well, I don't know if our audience will be able to understand, but anyway, I too have been thinking about these issues, right? Particularly as the U.S. Supreme Court has continued to narrow the rights that we enjoy and have taken for granted, like choice. And also, they have gutted the Voting Rights Act, right? These sort of basic, civil rights law on which as a country we have depended for, 50 plus years. So I have been, in my work and in my thinking, I really have started looking for the principles embodied in the Universal Declaration in state constitutions. And it really is pretty amazing what I'm finding, because as you mentioned, Susan, the rights articulated in our federal constitution, which is very libertarian, is, you can be from the government from interference so that you can, achieve, happiness and liberty and own property. But on the state constitutional level, there are more positive rights that have been articulated, and many of those rights are actually re-articulations of what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states very clearly and very simply. And it's taking me a long time to formulate my question, but the thought is this, that I know that people are concerned about this return to states' rights, or those sort of the right wing's push to returning to state rights. But, and this is a big but, if the state constitutions really do offer us many of the same rights in positive forms in the same way that the Universal Declaration does, that actually, particularly in some states, might not be a bad idea. And we're seeing this, we're seeing this principle pop up in very, very conservative states where they have enacted legislation that restricts the right to an abortion. And the courts there are saying, well, the state constitution, we don't care what the Supreme Court says. It threw this back to the states, but our state constitutions actually recognize this ability to choose, whether it's actually acknowledging the right to choose, or whether the state courts are actually reading it into the right of privacy that exists in those constitutions, literally. So my question is maybe we should all be shifting and thinking about, really elevating our state constitutions and start looking at them in the same way that we look at human rights, because those in many instances embody the same principles. So I'd like both of your comments on that.
Okay, well, I will start. So Penny, we have to compare notes because one chapter that I have right now is how to work with the state constitutions. And there's a guy who wrote a book, I think on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration, maybe the 60th, going through all the state constitutions and showing, which ones had which rights. There are two states, Vermont and I think Hawaii, have a right to, no, Louisiana, Vermont and Louisiana, which was from a French tradition, right, have a right to dignity in their state constitutions. And then there are a bunch that almost all state constitutions have a right to public education. So you're absolutely right that the state constitutions at this point are a much more promising source of these are our values, this is what's important, this is something you could go to court and say, I have a right. In terms of whether we're returning to states' rights, one of the smartest people I know, Bert Newborn, referred to federalism as a self-correcting constitutional compass. So I don't think that the idea is we're promoting states' rights and therefore we never again need a federal government. Mm-hmm. I think the pendulum swings and you go where you need to. So there have been a number of states in which the state constitution has been the basis for finding that there is in fact a right to choice in Montana. And then there have been a number of states in which, so the state constitutions have been very important. It's not all states, of course, so it would be much better if you could be national. But it would be delusional at this point to think that we could amend the US Constitution to include the principles of the Declaration, or that Congress is going to, Congress can't agree. Not only can the House not agree on a speaker, they can't agree on lunch. Right? So the federal government isn't doing anything much anytime soon. And they're fighting tooth and nail to try to keep the Biden administration from doing anything. So I think we're kind of stymied on a national level. So I don't think it's necessarily a matter of choice to go to the states instead. It's a matter of necessity. And then there's also the idea, there were a number of cases that were decisions written by Anthony Kennedy, where the Supreme Court had held that there was no federal right. So, for example, in 1986, the Supreme Court said in a case called Bowers versus Hardwick that it had to be facetious to claim that homosexuals had a right to have the kind of sex they wanted, and upheld a really draconian consensual sodomy law in Georgia. Well, 17 years later, Justice Kennedy looks at the same issue and he says, well, look, there are a number of states here that have come along, including Georgia, and the states aren't so much doing this anymore. So now maybe we should take this as something that is kind of bleeding into the federal constitution. We're developing a consensus here. He said the same thing in the Obergefell case about same-sex marriage. Enough states had gotten there that he was able to say, okay, this is now looking like a national consensus. So it seems to me long-term, and this may be very long-term, the state constitutions may not just be a source of patchwork, better protections in some places, but it could be part of a movement and part of a trend that would ultimately nationalize.
Elisa, do you want to comment on that? Just you shaking your head.
Yeah, just one thing to add to that, which is while the actual amendment of state constitutions may be a long-term strategy, there's a short-term benefit of these efforts, and that is, kind of going back to what I said in my opening remarks, the growing of kind of local movements of people who are, claiming these rights and talking about what they mean to them in their own communities is really exciting. And I think that is where, real change happens is, locally, as Eleanor said, close to the problem, small places close to home. And so the actual, just the act of joining together in communities of people who are demanding these rights is a positive development that can lift a lot of votes, no matter if it ends up being a change in state constitutions or building a broader national movement for these rights to be recognized at the national level.
Great. I wrote a question down when you were speaking, Elisa. So you began your talk by saying that the path to global peace and security begins with a life of dignity, right? And you said that that was the underlying principle to the Universal Declaration, which is absolutely correct. And so the question I have, I want to sort of just flip it a little, which is, do you think that our world is in such a mess and that authoritarianism is on the rise because in much of the world, people do not live a life of dignity, right? I mean, the drafters of the Universal Declaration said that these two were integrally linked, as you said, right? They're inseparable. And are we where we are because we have not, as the countries of the world, been actually giving people the dignity that they're born with and that they deserve, and that the Universal Declaration says that they have?
Yeah, well, I think that's definitely part of it. I mean, that, this contest between democracy and authoritarianism, we've been on the wrong side of that for a while, and we've seen a decrease in, in the strength of democracies and a rise of authoritarianism. And, I think it's complicated. There are a lot of factors that contribute to that, but certainly authoritarians, you see this from China, you certainly see it from Russia, from the leaders of those countries, not necessarily their citizens. I really want to distinguish that, but that they're exploiting that failure to, push forward their case for a vision of a different kind of world order. And so, and I do think that, the denial of basic human dignity makes it easier for people to, be attracted to that message a strong man that can solve all of their problems. And we have to, it's essential that we win that struggle. And I think what the Universal Declaration tells us is that we cannot, unless we seriously commit to lifting people up and recognizing that these are rights.
Right, and that goes back to what Susan was really focusing on, and what people were criticizing the U.S. for, is not focusing enough on social and economic rights. So Susan, I don't know if you want to comment on the question that I posed: is, are we in the situation we are as globally because not enough attention is given to dignity more generally?
Well, I think that's right. And I think there are a lot of different ways that plays out. Elisa was talking before about, people who are actually in a caste in their countries who are enslaved. And clearly that rests on dignity. How can you enslave somebody if they are your brother, if they're a person who has the same right to dignity that you do and to have happiness? So I think the concept plays out differently in different places. Here in the United States, because we are so invested in the idea of liberty and that I get to do what I want to do, I think our problem is that sometimes we are too overwhelmingly libertarian because people are only focused on, can the government make me? And not on the voice that should be inside their own heads saying to themselves, is this the right thing to do? So one example that I would give is one area where there's been a lot of controversy and contention is free speech on campus. A student makes a racist joke and they say, I have a right to make a racist joke. And what they mean by right in the US constitutional sense is, under the First Amendment, a government entity, whether it's a public university or a city or the federal government, can't punish somebody for the content of what they say. And that's right. And I think that's a good principle. But if you also believe in dignity, maybe there's that voice in your head that's saying to you, well, I have a right to do this, and I don't think the government should be able to punish me. But maybe it's not actually a good idea because I'm aware of the fact that I'm really hurting other people by doing this, and it's offending them. And I think what the concept of dignity says is that it is up to each of us. It's not just up to the government to enforce dignity, because they can't. They can't make us care about each other and be empathetic. But I think once you triangulate some more, it's not just about the individual's relationship with the government, then you have something much more nuanced that's going on, and much more than the pitched battle between, do I have a right to make a racist joke, or do you have a right not to have me make a racist joke because it makes you feel less equal? So there are a lot of people in this country who argue that we can't have both liberty and equality. And I think it may be true that you cannot have both unless you also recognize the dignity or the fraternity aspect, because that puts the duty on all of us. It's not just about what the government can do to me. It's about what should I be, how should I be responding to other people?
So you both touched on this, and I want to just explore it a little bit more. This notion of, the working at the very, very local level. And we talked a little bit about state constitutions, but I want to go even, sort of more local than that. And you both have mentioned ordinances being enacted to grant some of the rights that are discussed in the Universal Declaration. So the question is it in terms of embracing the principles in the Universal Declaration, is it helpful to actually say housing is a human right, even though it's not recognized as a human right as by many of our courts? Do you think that, sort of talking about certain things like, housing and food, and as you both mentioned, education is actually codified in state constitutions, I think all 50 constitutions. Do you think that's helpful in embracing some of the principles, if not all of the principles that are articulated in the Universal Declaration?
I do. I do very much, because, I hear from some people, oh, if everything is a right, then it cheapens the idea of a right and all that. Well, the Universal Declaration doesn't talk about everything. It isn't everything. These are the agreed essential elements of a life of dignity. And, as I said at the beginning, I think these are rights. The question is, will the government act that way? And, I see us moving more in that direction. The idea of a right to health in the United States, which has been, really has come a long way in the last, since the Clinton administration, Hillary Clinton first starting to talk about healthcare as a human right. I think most people in the United States now feel some, entitlement that as a human being, it's wrong for people not to have access to basic healthcare. Of course, there are gradations and, and sometimes people say, well, those rights cost money. Well, guess what? A free trial, a fair trial, that costs money. Voting, that costs money. All of these things. And so the question is, what are governments committing to do for their people? What does it mean for democracies to deliver? The right to housing, for example, I think that has come a long way in the way people are thinking about. We know that there's something wrong with our society when we have, so many people unhoused, that people are coming to the realization that that's not primarily the fault of those people, that there's something wrong with our society that accepts that. And it's not how we want to live. So I think we're moving in that direction. And I do think conceiving of these things as human rights is helpful, and it helps mobilize people. And it also gives people a sense that this is that the struggle for the recognition of those rights, that there's solidarity across nations, that there are people everywhere who believe that these are the essential elements of a life of dignity, and that we can learn from each other and we can join together, just as the bad guys and the authoritarians are constantly learning from each other. We can do that too. So I think it's quite important to embrace all of these concepts in the Universal Declaration as human rights, and to start to build a world where it's true.
Susan, do you know?
Let me say, I think that, I hope that's right. And I hope that, the Poor People's Campaign gets, I wish we could get back to the Four Freedoms movement and really make a lot of progress. And again, maybe it'll start on the local level, maybe it'll spread. But I want to turn the kaleidoscope again and focus not on what government does, but what we all do for each other. Because again, that's the kind of the third pillar of the Declaration. It's not, and that's how Eleanor Roosevelt sold it. We're not necessarily saying that governments have to do anything about housing. Okay, maybe that comes later. But what we are saying is we all have duties to each other, and at least we should be making choices in a way, our own choices in a way that will help other people to live a good life and be housed and et cetera. So I'll give you an example of something that's not about government, but is actually kind of anti-government. So my colleague Jocelyn Simonson has recently published a book called Radical Acts of Justice. And what she's talking about is movements all over the country that are kind of local populist movement to fight back against the carceral state. So one possibility is, a person has bail set and they can't afford the bail, so they're going to have to stay in pretrial detention until their trial comes. Well, there are now more and more community bail funds where everyone will chip in so that the community will just bail this person out so that they will not be suffering. There are other examples that she gives of ways in which there have been interventions in the criminal justice system just by local people who want to take the criminal system back. They don't want to just leave it to the government because they see the government as being oppressive on partially in a disproportionately racially based kind of way. And so it's not only government, I think, and that kind of thing, the grassroots movement. I just read a piece that was in the New York Times feed about a community in Paris that is a very local neighborhood community that's trying to approach everything on a local level. And in titling the article, the New York Times feed called that fraternité. And so, that's the starting at the local level. So I think one of the mistakes here is that people immediately go to what is the government doing? What are they doing to me? And what are we saying they have to do for me? And that's very contentious. I feel like if you get beyond that, and if you start talking about person to person and our duties to one another, and would we rather live in a society that is a family rather than a society where everybody is pitted apart on the basis of what they believe, then I think we do much better. I'll tell you a little anecdote about the person who I think is still currently Miss Texas, Avery Bishop. So she lives in Texas, obviously, and she's a Democrat. So she has been on social media disagreeing with a lot of Texas's policies about what children can be allowed to read or learn in school or all kinds of things. So the pageant organizers were a little concerned because they've always been apolitical about whether she was going to be going out to schools and getting into trouble because she would be, the students would disagree and she'd be pitting them against each other. And she said, I'm going to talk to students about inclusion and diversity, but I'm going to do it my way. So she would go to a high school and she would say to the students, when I was growing up, I thought I was ugly. People made fun of the way my eyes looked, and I really felt badly about myself. And it took a really long time before I was able to accept the fact that maybe I'm not ugly. And here I am being Miss Texas. So have any of you felt that way? Do you ever feel like other people pick on you and make you feel you're ugly? And okay, so if you care about that, how about, are there other kids there who you would worry that maybe people are picking on them and maybe they feel bad? And what can you do about that? And, what could be more local than that and more individual? So again, I think, what I'm interested in here, there's, been a lot of people talking about the affirmative obligations of government. But what is to me so brilliant about Rene Cassin's concept here of dignity, of fraternity, is that it's not only about the government, it's about all of us. So even if we have a right, a libertarian right as to the government, that the government can't punish us for speaking or for doing whatever we're doing, that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have obligations to one another. And that is the premise, I think, one of the central pillars, the third pillar of the Declaration. Penny, you're on mute.
Yes,
There you are.
thank you. So this is a really interesting discussion, and I'm going to bring in members of our audience so they can participate and then they can ask some questions. And I'm going to turn it over to Lee Chinitz to pose some of the questions to both of you.
Yeah, there's actually two that came in right at the start that I think are directly related to what Susan, you were talking about in terms of rights versus, let's say, dignity. So I'm going to read them together, and maybe you guys can just sort of answer as you would like. The first one is from Michael James. It says, some see the right to be free from discrimination as a human right, while others see it as a limitation on how they're treated or how they must act towards others and in society. How do you reconcile this opposing, these opposing views? I'm thinking in particular of those who feel that they're losing rights, as others point to needing their rights enforced. I don't know if he was thinking about this, but like when I read that question, I think of the whole sort of Baker, case, in terms of like whether or not a person with a shop can choose to not, make a wedding cake for somebody who that they don't approve of their lifestyle. And then the second question also feels very similar. It says, how does forcing masks or vaccinations fit in? So is the public good a right? Does this also relate to dignity? And again, I definitely feel like you see this conversation a lot, right? If you feel like you should have, the right to your own personal bodily autonomy, how does that fit in with whatever right you may or not have towards the community at large? So those are the first two.
Okay, well, I think you're right, Lee, that those go well together. And to me, the answer again is it's not about government. It's about this sense of duty that we have to one another. So let me start with the pandemic questions first. So I live in Brooklyn, and toward the beginning of the pandemic, when the governments were coming up with masking requirements and social distancing requirements and closing down businesses, my neighbors all felt that this was a good thing, and that even the people who did not feel personally threatened because they were young and healthy and they would have chosen to go to the store. But I heard any number of people to say, but I think it's a good thing if we all agree not to do that, because then we are keeping safe the most vulnerable people in our community. So one question is, can the government make you do it? But I think that if that's your only question, they can't make me wear a mask. Why should you not want to wear a mask? If you're talking about your own household and you have an 80-year-old grandfather who's living in your household, are you going to say, well, I'm just not going to wear a mask. I don't care if my grandfather gets sick. And I think the whole point of the dignity idea, the fraternity idea, is if you would do it for your grandfather, do it for people you don't know also. It's not just, treat everybody as if they're a member of your family. And I think that the whole, liberty versus discrimination is the same kind of thing. If your sister were getting married, and you would make her a wedding cake, or you would agree to, design the website for her wedding. Shouldn't you also be saying to yourself, how do other people feel when I treat them differently, when I discriminate against them? For a long time, there have been claims about liberty as opposed to discrimination. It used to be that there were many Christians who thought that there were racial hierarchies that they could abide by, and that they could discriminate on the basis of race. For a long time, there were religions that said that a man is the head of the family and therefore a woman should not get equal pay. And our tradition has been that religions cannot impose discrimination on other people. We would not force a church itself to a Catholic church to hire a woman priest. That's their right to conduct themselves the way they want. But I don't think, especially the people who are baking cakes and designing websites, if they want to hold themselves out to the public as here's what I do, there can be some conditions on that. And so again, one of where we've gotten stuck is, what can the government make me do? Can they really make me do something that I don't want to do, or that's against my religion? Whereas the question should really be, if we have a voice inside our heads that say, these are people also. The guy in Masterpiece Cake Shop who wouldn't bake a cake for the two men who wanted to get married literally said, I would rather bake a wedding cake for two dogs. Now, that's just not treating other people as human beings. So let me say one more thing about the pandemic question, because I think that since the beginning of the pandemic, over time, I think the more libertarian voices started to become more and more dominant. That I shouldn't have to limit my own activities, and there's not really that great a danger. And I think that the people who don't want vaccinations, I think that's a slightly different situation, because some people actually fear that what's in their own body is going to be dangerous. Traditionally in the United States, that has been regarded as a matter of public good as opposed to right. But again, I think that you think about the issue completely differently if you add the idea that it's not just, this country is not just about every man for him or herself. It is about, we should be thinking about one another. I think it just makes all those questions look different.
I wanted to
I'm sorry, can I do a quick follow-up? I think that answer is really great, and I love the idea of that. But we're 300 million people, right? Not everybody is going to have that way of looking at things, or even if they do, they might say, yeah, look, if it were my sister and she were, gay, I would not bake her a cake, right? I mean, that could be their approach. And again, with the vaccine thing, right? You're saying, well, you should get it because you do it for your grandfather. Well, maybe there are people who wouldn't do it for their grandfather. They just don't believe, right? So is there no place that you see where where let's, where as a society we say, look, this is the decision we've made as a society. Not everyone's going to go along, but we do have to force it, right? I mean, or do you see it really just comes down to individual?
I'm not advocating that everybody gets to decide for themselves whether to treat other people as with dignity, and therefore what laws they're going to follow or not follow. There are still going to be questions of balancing, where you have the 1905, the Supreme Court decided a case saying, yes, you can punish people for not getting a vaccination. And there is still going to be a question of our liberty is always conditioned on if there's a strong enough public interest, that can overcome the liberty. So I'm not saying that won't still be true. Yet there will be situations where people may be forced to do something, whether they agree with it or not. I'm just saying that I think that the decision making, the balance there, how you're looking at the picture is much more complicated. If it's the do I have a right question as against the government is not the only question we're thinking of. So Elisa or Penny, do you have any thoughts on that? Or
I just wanted to just add one comment, and I'd like to hear what Elisa has to think about it too. But the question is this notion of fraternité, which is part of the Universal Declaration that we function as a society on the local level and also on the global level. But is it translatable into US culture? Are we just so programmed to think of ourselves as having to protect ourselves from the big bad government that we can't even think about those concepts, which are really basic to embracing the principles of the Universal Declaration. And it really is it's a bare bones document with very, very, very basic principles. And I think the thinking was that everybody can then take it and enact laws within their countries that reflect these principles, and are some countries just not capable of actually doing that. And is the US one of them?
Well, I think it's a great question, and it's one that I'm struggling with now. My working title for the book is American Fraternité. And I think certainly there would have to be a different version in this country. So one of the things about fraternity in France is that I think it pairs with the French concept of laïcité, which is, if you're being overtly religious, you're not being French. So the French, I'm sure we've all been reading about the French, preventing girls from wearing hijabs to school or the burkini on the beach. And that's their very communitarian idea. If you're being French, then you don't want to stick out and be religious. And that wouldn't fly in the United States. We have a clear sense that you do have the right to wear something that is going to distinguish you, as a believer in a particular religion in public, and that's very important to us. So that again, that's where kind of Scott Warren got some relief from his religious beliefs. But just because you're not going to do the full French version of communitarian, and I think again, René Cassin did not use the word fraternity. And he did not directly use the whole French package of what they may mean by fraternity in the Declaration. Instead, he used this idea of dignity. And I don't think that there's anything there that should be inconsistent with American values. Again, if you look at all these values as being intersectional and interdependent, and I think that there is space to look at the Reconstruction amendments, especially the 13th Amendment, which prohibits everybody from enslaving anyone else. It's not only about government. It just says there shall be no slavery or involuntary servitude, period. And that talks to everybody. And the 14th Amendment says everyone gets birthright citizenship. There's no caste here. And so there are a lot of very deep principles that are about equality, but they're also about dignity to me. But what you're saying, Penny, I think is another way of saying that the people in the United States give lip service to the Declaration, but they don't actually know what's in it. And I think that there would be a lot of pushback if people did know about the affirmative rights as well as the whole idea of this dignity right. So to me, one of the big questions, that maybe Lisa would like to comment on, or you, is how do we educate people about these rights and why they're important?
Yeah, I think that I think that that this dignity and treating each other, the golden rule and fraternité is a lot easier to build and to accomplish, in smaller, the smaller entity that you go to, like neighborhoods, communities, because, in order to build this sense of empathy in a way that you're talking about, Susan, in some ways you have to get to know people and be curious about other people and what they care about and what their fears are. And it's a lot more difficult to distance yourself and, to other someone once you've gotten to know them. So it may be that the bright spot to look for in this quest for a more just and peaceful world is to start small. As again, Eleanor Roosevelt said, small places close to home. I really believe that, that is a place where these values are maybe more likely to thrive. Even in the most bitter situations, if you think about what's happening in Israel and Gaza right now, I'm getting daily reports from friends there who are saying, in the midst of all of this horrific violence and there are people coming across Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis in communities, in small neighborhoods, coming together and saying, we're going to work together to make sure violence doesn't break out in our community. And, even the smallest, kind of neighborhood is a place where people who know each other, who come to trust each other, can start to build, and be more resilient.
The thing is that it's not it shouldn't be an either or, right? I mean, we're talking about having it be grassroots, right? That there's a lot of room for movement and embracing the principles embodied in the Universal Declaration on a very grassroots level. But we also know that laws really change people's minds, they change society. And, without the civil rights laws from the 1960s, the world would be a very, very different place. Without the, without the, post-Civil War amendments, the world would be a horrible place. Without, anti-discrimination laws in the workplace, the world would be a really terrible place. So we need it moving from both directions and also from side to side. And, I guess this is a question more directed at Lisa, since you're just so involved in, in the, human rights movement, but also in the, power structure in DC. Is it possible for the US to actually ratify some of the foundational human rights treaties that to date it has not ratified? Is it possible to get the US so we can have the, sort of the government say, yes, we accept these rights, even though you can't sue to enforce them, but that's a different story. But by virtue of the fact that the US would say, yes, we ratify this treaty, again, that is, coming from the top down. And, is there any possibility of this happening at all?
Well, first of all, I think that the movement to get the treaties ratified is useful in its own right because of the movement building that requires and people learning about and understanding what the treaties mean. But it's no, ratifying the treaties, particularly the way that the United States has tended to do that, has not, the way the US ratifies treaties is it gets its lawyers involved in going through with the fine tooth comb and looking at all the requirements of, say, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is, the one that the US really, is behind. And even so, the ratification process for that was going through that treaty with a fine tooth comb, finding anything that the US was not already doing.
Right.
And saying, but we're not going to commit ourselves to doing that, which is not the point of these treaties. That's the US thinking about these human rights treaties as more of a foreign policy issue and how it's going to be in the world. It's like this is the province of the State Department, when really most of the things that the Civil and Political Covenant deal with or any of the human rights treaties, really they are the province of the domestic agencies of government. So for example, the US did ratify the Convention Against Torture, and then we all know what happened. So it's not a panacea. The US ratified the Genocide Convention, the US ratified the ICCPR, the Convention Against Torture, and some others, but not the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention on the Rights of the Child and those. And I do think it's important for the US to do that because, the US wants to be a global leader. And in many ways, the rest of the world, despite all of our flaws and hypocrisy, still looks to the United States and cares what the United States says and does about the integrity of these rights. That's why it was so, when the US blatantly violates rights laid out in the UDHR, it's so damaging to the concept of these as universal rights. But I think we have to approach this as Americans with great humility. And I do think I hear those words coming a lot from the Biden administration about, an acknowledgement that we have a long way to go in our own, delivery on the promise of our democracy and but of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And nobody is perfect, but we need to be, pushing forward with, the recognition of these treaties as important and as rights, and they're important in the rest of the world. When the US either doesn't recognize those rights or ratifies treaties and doesn't comply with them, the people who are most hurt are people in, dark corners of repressive countries who are desperately hoping to advance the concept in their own societies that these are rights, and the US is undermining that struggle. And those are really our human rights allies around the world. We have to be thinking about what our actions do to them.
I think what you're saying, Elisa, also has a lot to do with the question of how do you educate people about what's actually in the Declaration. And I think that you were talking about the kind of the top down, the humility of the government being able to say, we don't know everything, we're not the model for everything. Sometimes we have things to learn. But I think that it's a tough sell to imagine the schools actually educating students about the Declaration and what's in it, given that at this point, there are a lot of schools that aren't even doing civic education about the United States Constitution because there's such polarization about what you would teach and such battles about, what's the correct message. So on the one hand, it feels like, the way to make progress is not just to expect an administration to do something, but to expect them to have the support to do something, because there are a lot of Americans who understand that we do have things to learn. And I think that there are a lot of people in the United States who feel that human rights is what we export, is not what we import. We're good at human rights. We're good at civil and political rights, and we're the model, and everyone should look up to us. As opposed to, my feeling in Dublin of, wait a minute, we're missing a lot here.
Right.
These people are ahead of us in many ways.
Right. Lee, you have some more questions from our audience.
Yeah, there's two more, but I think since Elisa opened this topic, it might be good to jump to the last one, which is what's the role of international human rights law in the context of the Palestine-Israel conflict? I think it's kind of what you were saying, Penny. There's that sort of grassroots local part, I think, which is what you raised, Elisa, but then this question is about international human rights law. I mean, how does that play in?
Yeah, well, you know, there are two separate bodies of law that intersect. One is international human rights law, and the other is international humanitarian law, which people often refer to as the laws of war, that govern, you know, in extreme cases where there's an armed conflict, whether it's a international armed conflict or a non-international armed conflict. That's not my area of expertise, but there are, you know, there's a common conception that, you know, when during wartime kind of human rights law gets set aside, and that's not at all true. And in fact, you know, going back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, what leads to these kinds of conflicts tends to be the violation of human rights and the failure to recognize and uphold the essential human dignity of all people. So there's clearly connections, and there's, you know, if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, those, particularly those affirmative rights, those are rights that everyone in that context is entitled to. And when you have situations of occupation, there are particular obligations of an occupying power to the people under their rule. Again, I'm not an expert on the details of those rights, but there's certainly plenty to be applied in the context of what's happening in the Middle East right now, and has been from, you know, for a long time going back. Lots of relevance.
But let me say too that Rene Cassin said that the declaration is like a triptych, the form of it. The first step was getting the declaration, which was something of a miracle that everybody agreed to the aspirations and principles. The second step was the covenants, to actually say what should happen on the basis of that. And the third step was enforcement. And that is in some ways the toughest. So there have been crumbs of places where the UN will have hearings, the High Commissioner on Refugees will have hearings, but you could ask, how does international law apply? But whether or not international law has any teeth, who's going to enforce it is a whole other question.
Yeah.
And I just want to add one thing before we go to the last question, but some nations have actually incorporated various human rights treaties into their own national laws. And actually some municipalities in the US have incorporated parts of human rights treaties into their municipal laws. And that's where you can get enforcement. But without that, it's very, very difficult to enforce. Lee, I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
No, I wasn't. I have the last question, but are you done with that comment? Okay. So yeah, just the last question. In a lot of your responses to things, you've said the word, the affirmative rights. So I think this last question kind of touches on that, and maybe this question about whether or not the United States is a place that can even, is kind of structured or has the right attitude to implement some of these. The question is, could you speak to the ways in which the absence of positive rights in the US, like those articulated in the UDHR, feed attitudes towards business or corporate responsibility for communities, with some examples, but I think that's the basic idea, right? I mean, if we don't explicitly say these things, do we push all this requirement off onto businesses?
Yeah, and in the same way that the person asking the question about the pandemic is seeing a kind of a conflict or tension, if there aren't any rights, and if you're asking Exxon, to what are they going to do about the environment, or what are their policies? On the one hand, we're wishing that if they were paying attention to the good of other people, that they would be careful about what they're doing and would not be excusing practices that are harmful to the environment. But on the other hand, their point is to make money. So corporations are kind of in a more complicated place than individuals. But I think you would still hope, I think the declaration is not directly talking to corporations, but you would hope that the people who run corporations would still have some sense of, what's appropriate to do. So during the reaction to 9/11, where the telecoms were all providing masses of information to the government, one thing that the ACLU tried to do was to talk to the shareholders of these corporations to get them to say, is that what you want your money to be going to? Wouldn't you like to say, we want your corporation to have a better policy? So in a way, even the corporations, I think, come back to individual people.
Yeah, I mean, there's been huge developments in this area over the last 15 years where, I think through something called the Ruggie principles, John Ruggie at developing principles for responsible business, and a recognition that, companies, many, multinational companies have assets and budgets that far exceed the governments of lots of countries. And a recognition that what businesses do can impact the human rights of people all over the world. So there has been a growing movement to have business leaders understand their role, if you will, Susan, in this ecosystem or community that we all live in, where they are major players that can have a huge impact on people's lives, that they do have as private actors a responsibility for their actions and how those impact the human rights of people around the world. And that's really developing, not just, I mean, Susan, yes, their goal is to make money, but there is also a growing understanding that sustainability of profit making companies relates very much to the impact that they have on people and the environment. The problem is that, they all have to do these quarterly profit, with Wall Street reports. And, that's not conducive to the longer term thinking of the impact of corporate conduct on our world. But there's been an enormous amount of progress in this area, and a number of responsible business leaders stepping forward and saying, we're going to do things differently, and also shareholders asking or demanding that they do things differently, and also fiduciaries and investors saying we're going to look at these things now as we consider what's a good investment. Is it wise to be investing in companies that are destroying the planet? Maybe in the short term, but that is quite clearly a long-term losing proposition. So there's enormous growth in that area. It's a great question.
Actually, if I could add one more thing, domestically, a lot of the corporations, including like the NBA and major corporations, have actually done a great job of influencing public policy in individual states by saying, unless your state changes the policy on X, we're going to pull out. We're not going to have tournaments here. We're not going to have our conferences here. So there's a tremendous amount of power that corporations have to do good.
I agree with what both of you said. I'm going to just bring it back to, sort of, we also need the legal structure and also the courts to be on board with this. And in terms of federal courts, at least in the United States, we really have a real sort of retrenchment from actually holding corporate entities accountable for gross human rights violations. And I'm talking about slavery and torture and rape that occurs in other countries to enhance corporate interests and enrich these very, very big corporations, particularly in the energy sector, which goes back to comments about sustainability. And it really is, the US, in terms of recognition of, sort of human rights, at least in the courts, the federal courts, for decades really were leaders in this field of saying, yes, we incorporate human rights law. We see that people have these basic human rights, and if they're violated, then we're opening our doors to you. And the amazing language in the 1980s case from the Second Circuit, Filartiga versus Peñarala, and I guess temporally it was close to the end of World War II, because sort of whatever strides we've made have been completely eviscerated by the Supreme Court in a series of decisions in the past 15 years. And so much so that the Canadian government issued an amazing decision a couple of years ago. The Supreme Court of, not the government, the Supreme Court of Canada issued a decision a couple of years ago that basically, it really is wagging its fingers at the US, and the decision itself, which is, like 50 or 60 pages long, uses the scholarship of American scholars to find that corporations can be sued in Canada for violations of human rights. I'm really, it really is a response to what the Supreme Court has actually, pulled away from. And so again, not only do we need, these private acts of kindness, right? And we should celebrate them, and especially if they become part of the DNA of a corporation, but we still need, sort of a watchdog, right? And it shouldn't be just the public. We should have an accountability system where the courts are really saying, okay, you've crossed the line, or the government in some way is saying, we are a capitalist country, but you have crossed the line here. And, sort of, it is, I think we can't really rely on asking corporations to do the right thing, because at the end of the day, they do have their bottom lines to think about. And also trends change, right? I mean, after George Floyd was murdered, corporations really stepped up, and they put in place diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. They started doing, I know law firms started to doing a lot of pro bono work on issues of anti-racism. And we're just a few years away, and they really are pulling back from those, sort of good citizenship acts, because sort of the worldview has changed, at least in this country, and there's no economic pressure on them to actually do those things. So I do think we need the governmental structure in place as well.
Okay, there was only one other question, but we are out of time, and I've got a lot of questions anyway, so I'm sure there's a lot of questions that people would have, but we do need to end. So Penny, I'll just hand it back to you to wrap up.
Okay, so anyway, Professor Susan Herman, Professor Elisa Massimino, thank you for your time and wisdom. I hope you'll return for a future program. This has been a real treat for me to be in your presence and to see you both again. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is an important document that warrants continued conversation. I'm glad we started it today. We appreciate your time and your thoughts on this essential topic. I invite everyone in the audience to go onto the Network for Responsible Public Policy, to their website, which is nfrpp.org, to see the great many events that the organization holds on important topics. And, when you go to their website and give your information, they can inform you of upcoming events. Also, folks should watch their emails for a brief summary of tonight's program. We really appreciate your input and use it to shape future programs. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Lee, as well, and Stephen, who are helping with this program. Thanks so much, and to be continued, I hope.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Penny.
Thank you all.
Okay.